Καλησπέρα και καλώς ήρθατε σε άλλη μια λέξη εκφραστικής ανάγνωσης εν μέσω κορονοϊού 2021. Σαν σήμερα, 6 Απριλίου, το 1971 πέθανε ο Ρώσος συνθέτης Igor Stravinsky και νομίζω ότι το έχω ξαναπεί σε προηγούμενο βίντεο. Τρέφω ιδιαίτερη αγάπη στην μουσική του Stravinsky, οπότε σήμερα θα διαβάσω πάλι από το Poetics of Music, τις ομιλίες που είχε κάνει στο Harvard και αυτή τη φορά θα διαβάσω την πρώτη διάλεξη με τίτλο Getting Acquainted. I consider it a great honor to occupy the Charles Eliot Norton Chair of Poetics today, and I take particular pleasure in thanking the committee that has so kindly invited me to address the students of Harvard University. I cannot conceal from you how happy I am to be speaking for the first time to an audience that is willing to take the trouble of listening and learning before judging. Up to the present, I have appeared on the concert platform and in theatre halls before those agglomerations of people that make up what we call the public. But never until today have I addressed an audience of students. As students undoubtedly eager to acquire solid information about matters that are presented to you, you will not be surprised if I warn you that the particular matter I am going to discuss with you is serious, more serious than is generally thought. I hope you will not be frightened by its density, by its specific gravity. I have no intention of overwhelming you, but it is difficult to talk about music if one considers only its material realities, and I should feel I were betraying music if I made it the subject of a dissertation hastily thrown together, sprinkled with anecdotes and amusing digressions. I shall not forget that I occupy a chair of Poetics, and it is no secret to any of you that the exact meaning of Poetics is the study of work to be done. The verb bein, from which the word is derived, means nothing else but to do or make. The Poetics of the classical philosophers did not consist of lyrical dissertations about natural talent and about the essence of beauty. For them, the single word techni embraced both the fine arts and the useful arts and was applied to the knowledge and study of the certain and inevitable rules of the craft. That is why Aristotle's Poetics constantly suggest ideas regarding personal work, arrangement of materials, and structure. The Poetics of Music is exactly what I am going to talk to you about. That is to say, I shall talk about making in the field of music. Suffice it to say that we shall not use music as a pretext for pleasant fancies. For myself, I am too much aware of the responsibility incumbent upon me not to take my task seriously. So if I greatly prize the advantage I have in speaking before you who are here to study and to get from me whatever I may be capable of giving, you in return will, I hope, enjoy the advantage of actually being witnesses of a series of musical confessions. Do not be alarmed. They will not be confessions of the Jean-Jacques Rousseau sort, and even less of the psychoanalytic sort which, under a pseudo-scientific guise, merely effect a sad profanation of man's real values and of his psychological and creative faculties. I should like to place my plan of confessions midway between an academic course, and may I call your attention to this term because I shall refer to it again in the course of my lessons, and what one might call an apology of my own general ideas. I use the word apology not in its current French sense, where it means eulogy, but in the sense of a justification and defense of my ideas and personal views. In fine, all this means that I shall be giving you dogmatic confidences. I am fully aware that the words dogma and dogmatic, however sparingly one may apply them to aesthetic matters or even to spiritual matters, never fail to offend, even to shock certain mentalities richer in sincerity than they are strong in certitudes. For that very reason, I insist all the more that you accept these terms to the full extent of their legitimate meaning, and I would advise you to recognize their validity, to become familiar with them, and hope that you will come to develop a taste for them. If I speak of the legitimate meaning of these terms, it is to emphasize the normal and natural use of the dogmatic element in any field of activity in which it becomes categorical and truly essential. In fact, we cannot observe the creative phenomenon independently of the form in which it is made manifest. Every formal process proceeds from a principle, and the study of this principle requires precisely what we call dogma. In other words, the need that we feel to bring order out of chaos, to extricate the straight line of our operation from the tangle of possibilities and from the indecision of vague thoughts, presupposes the necessity of some sort of dogmatism. I use the words dogma and dogmatic, then, only in so far as they designate an element essential to safeguarding the integrity of art and mind, and I maintain that in this context they do not usurp their function. The very fact that we have recourse to what we call order, that order which permits us to dogmatize in the field we are considering, not only develops our taste for dogmatism, it incites us to place our own creative activity under the aegis of dogmatism. That is why I should like to see you accept the term. Throughout my course and on every hand I shall call upon your feeling and your taste for order and discipline, for they, fed, informed, and sustained by positive concepts, form the basis of what is called dogma. For the moment, to guide you in the organization of your future studies, I must advise you that my course is to be limited to the development of these theses that will constitute an explanation of music in lesson form. Why do I use the word explanation, and just why do I speak of an explanation? Because what I intend to say to you will not constitute an impersonal exposition of general data, but will be an explanation of music as I conceive it. Nor will this explanation be any the less objective for being the fruit of my own experience and my personal observations. The fact that the value and efficacy of such an explanation have been tested in my own experience convinces me, and guarantees you, that I am not offering you a mass of mere opinions, but rather that I am submitting to you a body of findings which, though made by me, are nonetheless just as valid for others as for myself. Thus, it is not a question of my private feelings and tastes, nor is it a question of a theory of music projected through a subjective prism. My experiences and investigations are entirely objective, and my introspections have led me to question myself only that I might derive something concrete from them. These ideas that I am developing, these causes that I am defending and that I have been brought before you to defend in a systematic fashion, have served and will continue to serve as the basis for musical creation precisely because they have been developed in actual practice. And if you attribute any importance, however slight, to my creative work, which is the fruit of my conscience and my faith, then please give credit to the speculative concepts that have engendered my work and that have developed along with it. To explain, or in French to explicate, from the Latin explicare, to unfold, to develop, is to describe something, to discover its genesis, to note the relationship of things to each other, to seek to throw light upon them. To explain myself to you is also to explain myself to myself, and to be obliged to clear up matters that are distorted or betrayed by the ignorance and malevolence that one always finds united by some mysterious bond in most of the judgments that are passed upon the arts. Ignorance and malevolence are united in a single root. The latter benefits surreptitiously from the advantages it draws from the former. I do not know which is the more hateful. In itself, ignorance is, of course, no crime. It begins to be suspect when it pleads sincerity. For sincerity, as Rémy de Gourmont said, is hardly an explanation and is never an excuse. And malevolence never fails to plead ignorance as an attenuating circumstance. It will be readily granted that this shady collusion of ignorance, infirmity, and malice, to use the language of theology, justifies a rebuttal, a loyal and vigorous defence. That is how I understand the term polemic. So I am obliged to be polemical. First, in view of the subversion of musical values that I have just referred to, and secondly, in defence of a cause that may appear to be a personal one at first glance, but which in reality is not. Let me explain this second point. By some chance, which it pleases me to regard as a happy one, my person and my work have, in spite of myself, been stamped with a distinctive mark from the outset of my career and have played the part of a reagent. The contact of this reagent with the musical reality around me, with human environments and the world of ideas, has provoked various reactions whose violence has been equalled only by arbitrariness. It seems that everyone had the wrong address. But above and beyond my own work, these unthinking reactions have affected music as a whole and revealed the seriousness of a flaw in judgment that vitiated the musical consciousness of a whole epoch and invalidated all ideas, theses, and opinions that were put forth concerning one of the highest faculties of the spirit, music as an art. Let us not forget that Petrushka, The Rite of Spring, and The Nightingale appeared at a time characterized by profound changes that dislocated many things and troubled many minds. Not that these changes took place in the domain of aesthetics or on the level of modes of expression. That sort of upheaval had taken place at an earlier time, at the outset of my activities. The changes of which I speak affected a general revision of both the basic values and the primordial elements of the art of music. This revision, first apparent at the time I just spoke of, has continued unabated ever since. What I am here stating is self-evident and is clearly to be read from the unfolding of concrete facts and daily events we are now witnessing. I am well aware that there is a point of view that regards the period in which the Rite of Spring appeared as one that witnessed a revolution whose conquests are said to be in the process of assimilation today. I deny the validity of that opinion. I hold that it was wrong to have considered me a revolutionary. When the rite appeared, many opinions were advanced concerning it. In the tumult of contradictory opinions, my friend Maurice Ravel intervened practically alone to set matters right. He was able to see, and he said, that the novelty of the rite consisted not in the writing, not in the orchestration, not in the technical apparatus of the work, but in the musical entity. I was made a revolutionary in spite of myself. Now, revolutionary outbreaks are never completely spontaneous. There are clever people who bring about revolutions with malice aforethought. It is always necessary to guard against being misrepresented by those who impute to you an intention that is not your own. For myself, I never hear anyone talk about revolution without thinking of the conversation that G.K. Chesterton tells us he had on landing in France with a Calais innkeeper. The innkeeper complained bitterly of the harshness of life and the increasing lack of freedom. Quote, "It's hardly worth while," concluded the innkeeper, "to have had 3 revolutions only to end up every time just where you started." End quote. Whereupon Chesterton pointed out to him that a revolution, in the true sense of the word, was the movement of an object in motion that described a closed curve and thus always returned to the point from where it had started. The tone of a work like the rite may have appeared arrogant, the language that I spoke may have seemed harsh in its newness, but that in no way implies that it is revolutionary in the most subversive sense of the word. If one only need break a habit to merit being labelled revolutionary, then every musician who has something to say and who in order to say it goes beyond the bounds of established convention would be known as a revolutionary. Why burden the dictionary of the fine arts with this stertorous term, which designates in its most usual acceptation a state of turmoil and violence, when there are so many other words better adapted to designate originality? In truth, I should be hard-pressed to cite for you a single fact in the history of art that might be qualified as revolutionary. Art is by essence constructive. Revolution implies a disruption of equilibrium. To speak of revolution is to speak of a temporary chaos. Now, art is the contrary of chaos. It never gives itself up to chaos without immediately finding its living works, its every existence threatened. The quality of being revolutionary is generally attributed to artists in our day with a laudatory intent, undoubtedly because we are living in a period when revolution enjoys a kind of prestige among yesterday's elite. Let us understand each other. I am the first to recognize that daring is the motive force of the finest and greatest acts, which is all the more reason for not putting it unthinkingly at the service of disorder and base cravings in a desire to cause sensation at any price. I approve of daring, I set no limits to it, but likewise there are no limits to the mischief wrought by arbitrary acts. To enjoy to the full the conquests of daring, we must demand that it operate in a pitiless light. We are working in its favour when we denounce the false wares that would usurp its place. Gratuitous success spoils every substance, every form that it touches. In its blundering, it impairs the effectiveness of the most valuable discoveries, and at the same time corrupts the taste of its devotees, which explains why their taste often plunges without transition from the wildest complications to the flattest banalities. A musical complex, however harsh it may be, is legitimate to the extent to which it is genuine. But to recognize genuine values in the midst of the excesses of sham, one must be gifted with a sure instinct that our snobs hate all the more intensely for being themselves completely deprived thereof. Our vanguard elite, sworn perpetually to outdo itself, expects and requires that music should satisfy the taste for absurd cacophony. I say cacophony without fear of being classed with the ranks of conventional pompiers, the laudatores temporis acti, and in using the word I am certain I am not in the least reversing myself. My position in this regard is exactly the same as it was at the time when I composed the Rite, and when people saw fit to call me a revolutionary. Today, just as in the past, I am on my guard against counterfeit money and take care not to accept it for the true coin of the realm. Cacophony means bad sound, contraband merchandise, uncoordinated music that will not stand up under serious criticism. Whatever opinion one may hold about the music of Arnold Schönberg, to take as an example a composer evolving along lines essentially different from mine, both aesthetically and technically, whose works have frequently given rise to violent reactions or ironic smiles, it is impossible for a self-respecting mind, equipped with genuine musical culture, not to feel that the composer of Pierrot Lunaire is fully aware of what he is doing and that he is not trying to deceive anyone. He adopted the musical system that suited his needs, and within this system he is perfectly consistent with himself, perfectly coherent. One cannot dismiss music that he dislikes by labelling it cacophony. Equally degrading is the vanity of snobs who boast of an embarrassing familiarity with the world of the incomprehensible, and who delightedly confess that they find themselves in good company. It is not music they seek, but rather the effect of shock, the sensation that befuddles understanding. So I confess that I am completely insensitive to the prestige of revolution. All the noise it may make will not call forth the slightest echo in me. For revolution is one thing, innovation another. And even innovation, when not presented in an excessive form, is not always recognized by its contemporaries. Let me take as an example the work of a composer whom I choose purposely because his music, the qualities of which have long been clearly recognized, has become so universally popular that barrel organs everywhere have made it their own. I am speaking of Charles Gounod. Don't be surprised at my lingering over Gounod for a moment. It is not so much the composer of Faust who holds my attention as it is the example that Gounod offers us of a work whose most obvious merits were misunderstood when they were still new by the very people whose mission it is to be exactly informed about the realities they have to judge. Take Faust. The first critics of this famous opera refused to acknowledge in Gounod the melodic inventiveness that today seems to us the dominant trait of his talent. They even went so far as to question whether he had any melodic gift at all. They saw in Gounod, quote, a symphonist astray in the theatre, end quote, a, quote, severe musician, end quote, to use their own terms, and of course more, quote, learned, end quote, than, quote, inspired, end quote. Naturally, they reproached him with having, quote, achieved his effects not through the voices, but through the orchestra, end quote. In 1862, 3 years after the first performances of Faust, the Gazette Musicale of Paris declared quite flatly that Faust as a whole, quote, was not the work of a melodist, end quote. As for the famous Scudo, whose word was law for the Revue des Deux Mondes, this Scudo in the same year turned out the following historical masterpiece, which I should never forgive myself for not quoting to you in full. Monsieur Gounod, to his misfortune, admires certain outmoded portions of Beethoven's last quartets. They constitute the muddied wellspring from which issue the bad musicians of modern Germany. The Liszts, the Wagners, the Schumanns, and even Mendelssohn in certain questionable aspects of his style. If Monsieur Gounod has really made his own the doctrine of continuous melody, of the melody of the virgin forest and of the setting sun that constitutes the charm of Tannhäuser and of Lohengrin, a melody that may be compared to Harlequin's letter, quote, as for periods and commas, I don't give them a thought, I leave it to you to put them wherever you wish, end quote, Monsieur Gounod in that case, which I should like to believe impossible, will be irrevocably lost. But even the Germans corroborated the good Scudo after their fashion. As a matter of fact, one could read in the Münchner Neueste Nachrichten that Gounod wasn't French, but Belgian, and that his compositions did not bear the stamp of the contemporary French and Italian schools, but precisely that of the German school in which he had been educated and formed. Since the literature that springs up on every side of music has not changed in the last 70 years, and since, while music is constantly changing, the commentators who refuse to take note of these transformations do not themselves change, we must naturally take up cudgels. Therefore, I am going to be polemical. I am not afraid to admit this. I shall be polemical not in my own defence, but in order to defend in words all music and its principles, just as I defend them in a different way with my compositions. And now let me explain to you how my course is organised. It will be divided into 6 lessons, each of which shall have a separate title. The lesson that I have just presented to you, as you can readily see, is only a means of our getting acquainted with one another. In this first lesson, I have tried to summarize the guiding principles of my course. You know now that you are going to hear musical confessions, and you know what meaning I attach to that expression and how the apparently subjective character of the word is counteracted by my desire to give a clearly dogmatic character to these confidences. Our introduction to each other under the stern auspices of order and discipline should not frighten you, since my course will not be limited to an arid and impersonal exposition of general ideas, but will comprise as vital as possible an explanation of music as I understand it, an explanation of my personal experience, faithfully related to concrete values. My second lesson will take up the phenomenon of music. I shall leave aside the insoluble problem of the origins of music in order to dwell upon the musical phenomenon in itself, insofar as it emanates from a complete and well-balanced human being, endowed with the resources of his senses and armed with his intellect. We shall study the phenomenon of music as a form of speculation in terms of sound and time. We shall derive from this study the dialectics of the creative process. In this connection, I shall speak to you of the principle of contrast and similarity. The second part of that lesson will be devoted to the elements and the morphology of music. The composing of music will be the subject matter of my third lesson. In it we shall consider the following questions. What is composition and what is the composer? Just how and to what degree is the composer a creator? These considerations will lead us to study one by one the formal elements of the craft of music. In this connection we shall have to make very explicit the concepts of invention, imagination, inspiration, of culture and taste, of order as rule and as law opposed to disorder, and finally the opposition of the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom. The fourth lesson will take up musical typology, studied through an inspection of its historical origins and development. Typology presupposes an act of selection which presumes a certain method of discrimination. The analyses which this method prompts us to make will bring us to the problem of style, and beyond that to the play of formal elements, whose unfolding constitutes what might be called the biography of music. During the course of this lesson, I shall examine a number of questions that vitally concern us today. Those that involve the public, snobbery, patronage, and philistinism. Likewise modernism and academicism, and the eternal question of classicism and romanticism. The fifth lesson will be entirely devoted to Russian music. In connection with it I shall take up folklore and Russian musical culture, plainsong and music both sacred and profane. I shall also speak about the Italianism, Germanism, and Orientalism of 19th century Russian music. I shall call to mind the two disorders of the two Russias, the conservative and the revolutionary disorders. Finally, I shall speak to you about the neo-folklorism of the Soviets and of the degrading of musical values. The sixth and last lesson, which will take up actual performance, will lead me to a description of the physical phenomenon of music. I shall establish the elements that distinguish interpretation from execution, properly speaking, and in this regard I shall also speak of performers and their listeners, of the activity and passivity of the audience, as well as of the all-important problem of judgment or criticism. My epilogue will seek to determine the profound meaning of music and its essential aim, which is to promote a communion, a union of man with his fellow man and with the Supreme Being. As you see, this explanation of music that I am going to undertake for you, and I hope with you, will assume the form of a synthesis, of a system that will begin with an analysis of the phenomenon of music and terminate with the problem of the performing of music. You will note that I have not chosen the method most frequently applied in syntheses of this sort, the method which develops a thesis but by proceeding from the general to the particular. I shall go about it differently. I shall adopt a sort of parallelism, a method of synchronization. That is, I shall link up general principles with particular facts, constantly supporting the one with the other. For it should be recognized that it is only by reason of a practical necessity that we are obliged to differentiate things by arranging them in purely conventional categories such as, quote, primary and secondary, and, quote, principal and subordinate, end quote. Besides, my aim is not to separate the elements that concern us, but to single them out without disuniting them. The true hierarchy of phenomena, as well as the true hierarchy of relationships, takes on substance and form on a plane entirely apart from that of conventional classifications. Let me entertain the hope that the clarification of this thesis will be one of the results of my course, a result I greatly desire. Καλό βράδυ.